Hey, let's get back into it with reading out loud on the heavenly spheres. Um, Second part of chapter 1, starting on page 4 with the is it subtitle, subtitle? I don't know. Brief history of astrology. Okay. The presentation of a complete history of astrology and its development falls beyond the scope of this book. What we present here is a very abridged version that highlights the principal moments, but which nevertheless leaves out some important references. Our objective is to give the student a general notion of the history of this discipline. Astrology is one of the oldest forms of knowledge. Its origins are lost in time, but are attested to as far back as the birth of human civilization. The observation and study of the movements of the stars emerged at a time when the lives of humans were tied to the cycles in nature. The observation of the seasons of the year and the phases of the moon is ancient, and the regularity of these cycles is an orienting marker for humans. The significance of this knowledge, which was that early on a symbolic and transcendent importance was attributed to it. The interpretive, symbolic, and metaphysical slant of these observations became the basis of astrology, while the mathematical vein appeared later to give rise to the study of astronomy. Until the 17th century, those two aspects of celestial knowledge were inseparable. The origins of astrology. The oldest vestiges of celestial observation go back to prehistory, to myths involving known constellations, some as old as, 30,000 BCE. However, astrology as we know it today only began to develop after man set down roots, its origins being immediately connected with the development of agriculture, Neolithic period. CA dot? I don't know. 6th millennium BCE. The need to understand nature's cycles was essential for growing crops. In the Near East, we encounter the earliest civilizations adoring the heavens and the stars and building megalithic structures in alignment with astronomical configurations or divine advice. So we're moving to the Mesopotamic period. The oldest divinatory observations involved not only the stars and planets, but also other celestial factors such as rainbows, the flight of birds, or the appearance of clouds. But an astrology similar to what we might recognize today began to develop in Mesopotamia around the 2nd millennium BCE. One of the oldest and most extensive documents from this period is known as Enuma Anu Anil and consists of a compilation of astrological observations and their corresponding omens. We also know that by this time, Egypt was already assigning astrological significance to the constellations, thereby timing their solar calendar. Thus, by the time of the Old Babylonian period, astrology had become as important as other divinatory methods and began to be expressed in the form of celestial omens. However, the astrological charts as we know of them today did not yet exist. The planets are the oldest factors in astrology. By the 2nd millennium, they were already a part of the Babylonian astral religion, and the characteristics of their tutelary deities were already more or less established and attributed to them. Although some alterations did occur as astrology migrated westward into Greece, in contrast, the houses and aspects did not yet exist, and calculations and interpretations followed different rules from what we use today. It was the 1st millennium BCE that more refined observational methods and astronomical calculations began, and when the astrological calculations began to come into use. Excuse me. This evolution led to the development of the zodiac, and with it, the attribution of planetary rulerships to signs. All of the religious tapestry of this time was favorable to the development of astrology, In fact, astrology was practiced by the priests who emphasized its magical, religious, and sacred aspects. Astrology was, above all, used for the study and prediction of collective events. Personal predictions were relatively rare, and in general observed for kings and other important figures. Astrological development reached its pinnacle during the Persian occupation. I gotta look that up. Middle of the 6th century BCE. During this period, the calendar was perfected and diaries of eclipses and other astronomical phenomena were compiled. The architecture of these civilizations also considered celestial phenomena. Temples and palaces were oriented with stellar alignments, and large construction projects were only begun when celestial conditions were considered favorable. So now we're going to move into the Greek or Hellenistic period. Around 700 BCE, the expansion of trade routes and the increase of contact between the populations of the Mediterranean led to the transmission of religious and philosophical thought. Astrology captured the interest of the Greek civilization and was further developed, transforming it into a structured discipline with scholastic standing. Very important figures such as Pythagoras, 571 BCE to 497 BCE, brought a wealth of knowledge from the Middle East that would be refined over the centuries. The geometrical theories and the great philosophies that underpinned Western astrology appeared. Renowned Greek thinkers such as Plato, 428 BCE to 3047 BCE, and Aristotle, 384 BCE to 322 BCE, developed astronomy and astrology with the creation of physical and metaphysical models of the universe. The earliest evidence for the calculation of the ascendant dates back to 200 BCE, an innovation that permitted the precise calculation of astrological houses. This increased mathematical precision led to the implementation of new concepts. The astrological chart, with all its components, was born. Simultaneously, natal astrology also emerged, and the individual birth charts gradually became more popular. I was trying to say began to appear at the same time, became more popular. That's what my brain does, predicts. Anyway, in the early century CE, new thinkers and noteworthy astrologers began to appear. Many manuals and treatises were written at this time. Of the scholars, Claudius Ptolemy, I figured out what CA is. I think CE is the old version or the new version of the BCE or AD BC something. Anyway, Claudius Ptolemy from CA 100 to CA 178 stands out. He compiled a large part of astrological knowledge of the time with his work, the Tetrabiblios. Later, this work became one of the great foundations of medieval astrologer and Arabic and European. In parentheses. With the slow disintegration of the Roman Empire and the adoption of Christianity as the official religion, in 313 by decree of the Emperor Constantine, the practice of astrology suffered its first decline. The Christian religion generated a strong anti-pagan current, and astrology began to fall into disfavor. The hostility toward astrology and other disciplines such as mathematics, philosophy, and medicine on the part of Christian religion seriously curbed its formal study. The situation was aggravated by the social and political uprisings that swept the Roman Empire during the following 100 years, culminating in its fall in the mid-6th century CE, when Europe entered the Dark Ages. Medieval period. After 632 CE, the Arabs became one of the great world powers, occupying the Middle East, Northern Africa, and Southern Europe, the Iberian Peninsula, also known as the Iberian Peninsula. Blessed by an immense interest in all advanced learning, the Arabs sought to collect Greek, Babylonian, and Persian knowledge in order to preserve and develop architecture, medicine, philosophy, and astrology/astronomy. It is thanks to the scholars of this period that much of the Western astrological thought has been preserved. Around 700 CE, several celebrated thinkers whose astrological works would influence and model Western astrological thought began to appear in the Arabic world. The Iberian Peninsula, particularly the Al-Andalus, was at the time one of the principal scholastic centers of the world. Arabic astrologers provided continuity with the Greek astrology, deepening its mathematical precision and expanding certain branches, notably horary. Can I do this? Yes. With the Christian reconquest and the Crusades of the 11th century, a phase of intellectual exchange was initiated that would foster development and innovation of astrological thought in the Christian world. An appreciation for the Western tradition was renewed, and many Arabic and Greek works were translated. During this time, astrologers achieved important roles in society, acting as advisors to kings and nobles. Nonetheless, tension with the Catholic Church continued, making astrology a risky profession. Astrology was primarily used as a means for diagnosing health problems. It also had a prominent role in political consulting. The Renaissance. The 15th and 16th centuries initiated an important change in attitude, the Renaissance. The concept of the individual was expanded, and the world was perceived in a different manner. The sciences and the arts were re-energized, and astrology underwent some transformations. The classical techniques were questioned, and some of the main principles were modified. The growing political discontentment with Arabs, represented by the Ottoman Empire, and the resurgence of Greek ideas led to the adoption of Ptolemy's Treatise on the Western astrologies as Western astrology's primary source. Yet Ptolemy did not mention several significant traditional factors and proposed a form of astrology that was divergent from his contemporaries. Thus, several traditional elements, understood to be Arabic innovations, were progressively discarded from the tradition. These changes created schism between the medieval astrologers and those of the Renaissance, engendering instability in astrological practice. During this time, the antagonism between astrology and the Catholic Church reached its apex. The Church condemned astrological judgments, aka judicial astrology, because of its political implications and because the power it conferred to astrologers, notwithstanding the fact that many clerics were steeped in astrological knowledge. The official practice of astrology in Christian kingdoms was restricted to less controversial matters, namely medicine and weather forecasting. In Protestant countries, astrology was more easily tolerated. Its flowering in Northern Europe after the 15th century was particularly notable. The decline of astrology. At the end of the 16th century, the development of the Age of Reason and scientific approach provoked an irreparable crisis in astrology. The scientific reasoning of the age declared astrology to be a superstition, and it was considered obsolete. The final severing between astrology and astronomy occurred in 1650. The practice of astrology still had some impetus in the 17th century, but thereafter entered into a rapid decline, having, by the start of the 18th century, almost completely disappeared. In 1770, the University of Salmanaka ceased teaching astrology, and the subject definitely left academic circles. Ironically, and in the context of the times, the loss of academic support constituted the collapse of the only protection keeping astrology from falling into superstition and mediocrity. In the attempt to keep the practice of astrology alive, some astrologers sought to reconcile the astrology's symbolic and metaphysical ideas with the mechanistic vision of scientific rationalism. However, their efforts produced more problems than benefits. In the hope of attaining acceptance from the prevailing views, they oversimplified the astrological system, impoverishing in its quality and function. The attempt to explain astrology scientifically led to the distortion of its fundamental principles. Astrology was regulated to popular entertainment and was increasingly ridiculed in popular almanacs by the end of the 18th century. Without adequate support or practice, the millennial astrological tradition was forgotten. The revival. Wah, wah, wah. In the second half of the 19th century, a revival of Oriental spirituality occurred. Many esoteric concepts and branches of many esoteric concepts and branches of thought were studied and recovered, and astrology was among them. The authors of this age desired not only to become restorers, but also reformers of the astrological tradition. Most notable was the theosophist Alan Leo, who, to avoid being charged with violating British laws against fortune-telling, innovated a practice of character analysis from the chart. Notwithstanding most good intentions, their work left something to be desired, as it attempted to reconstruct astrology on the basis of a model that was already abbreviated and devoid of any profound knowledge of tradition. It was upon this fragile and incomplete foundation that modern astrology found its footing. It centers almost entirely around natal astrology and discounts the tradition's predictive inflection. In addition, the modern approach lacks the philosophical structure that offers an impoverished oversimplification of interpretive techniques. This inadequate situation gave rise to several problems. On one hand, it allowed personal opinions and even the most ineffectual and uninformed ones to assume an authoritative voice. As the consequence of this proliferation, astrology propagated into numerous currents and approaches, many of which lack much substance. On the other hand, it led serious practitioners to dedicate themselves to other disciplines in the attempt to compensate for the shortcomings of their astrological practice, thereby perpetuating its convoluted state. And now we're moving to the modern approach. By the 20th century, with the emergence of psychology and the increasing interest of personal growth, psychological and humanistic astrology was born, centering astrology around the human being. This marriage of astrology and psychology and social sciences led to the appearance of ideological movements that called for astrology's use as a tool for self-growth. The psychological language was then adopted to astrology, and the concept of astrology as an adjunct to psychological counseling emerged. This astrology revolved around a sort of simplified form of psychoanalysis based upon astrological symbolism, rather than upon astrological interpretation itself. This point of view influenced every avenue of astrological development of the 20th century. Natal astrology, which examines individual horoscope, became the most practiced form of astrology, regulating the other branches, such as mundane and horary, to near extinction. Parallel to this, astrology was separated from the embarrassing legacy of prediction in such a way that its predictive function, an essential nucleus of astrology, became a taboo subject that was replaced by generalized forecasts. Understandably, the increase in astrological popularization led to the emergence of simplified variations. Sun sign astrology and magazine horoscopes were obvious products of the simplification of a once more highly complex system. In the 1960s and 1970s, a pro-spiritual culture emerged, an outgrowth of the 19th century importation of Oriental philosophies into Europe and America. It was at this time that themes such as reincarnation, karma, and meditation became a part of the common vernacular. In astrology, this influx of new ideas was translated into karmic, spiritual, and esoteric approaches, varying greatly in their quality. Some were more serious studies, while others involved the fastening, like to fasten, of personal beliefs to the astrological system. Meanwhile, the spiritual and metaphysical foundations of astrology remained largely ignored by the majority of its practitioners. In technical terms, the 20th century brought to astrology the ease of calculation provided by computers. Although this was a blessing to the serious practitioner of the art, it brings with it some inconveniences because it allows those with insufficient knowledge of astrology to professionally cast and interpret charts. Currently, we also bear witness to the appearance of numerous astrological techniques. Some of them were mere mathematical variations with little or no practical use. The thinking seems to be, what is new is good, as new techniques and approaches are invented every year. One finds, in addition to the inclusion of the trans-Saturnian planets, also known as Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, the indiscriminate use of copious asteroids and planetoids, leading to the ever more elaborate and unnecessary interpretations. As a reaction to the lack of objectivity in the modern astrology, the 1990s brought a movement toward a more classical and traditional orientation. This was encouraged by the translation and the publication of ancient texts. A compilation between the millennial practical tradition and the current one brings with it the understanding of how far contemporary astrology had strayed from its roots. And the rediscovery of tradition resulted in a resurgence of long-forgotten branches of horary and mundane astrology. Currently, astrology has begun a slow return to its origins, from where it is hoped it will reemerge as an intact, solid, and functional body of knowledge. It is up to its current students, us, and practitioners to continue to restore and venerate the astrological tradition. Let's see. There we go. My computer had closed and I had to open it. Okay, we'll start next with Chapter 2, The Universe According to Astrology. Thanks.